All right, for this lesson, lesson 2.2, we're going to continue graphing coordinate pairs on a coordinate plane, but the difference between this lesson and last lesson is that your coordinate pairs might be rational numbers, which, if you recall, means they could be decimals or fractions. So we're going to see how you handle that situation when you're graphing coordinate pairs today. So go ahead and turn to the next page, and we're going to just quickly review the do now answers. So looking at these answers to the do now, again, notice that now we have some spaces between the whole integers, and in this case we have a space exactly halfway, so we know it's going to be a 0.5 or a 1/2. It's going to be like 1.5 or 1.5. And that's what's different than what we did yesterday. And you can see where I would mark these appropriately. This is -1, -2, and in between is -1.5. All right, go ahead and turn to the next page, please. And take a quick look again at the homework answers and make sure you're good with all of these. And if you got something different, make sure you understand why you might have gotten yours wrong. And go ahead and turn to the next page. So here is, again, the vocabulary that we looked at yesterday and defined, but I wanted to add one more piece to this. I want to talk about the quadrants again. And just make a note of something that's special about the quadrants. So what I mean by that is I'm going to make a little chart here. And let's talk about quadrant 1. And we're going to look at the sign of x and the sign of y. And in quadrant 1, we know that x is positive and y is positive. But then if we look in quadrant 2, we know that x is negative, but y is positive. And then quadrant 3, we know that both x is negative and y is negative. Mm-hmm. And then quadrant 4, that bottom right quadrant, and let me just remind what we're looking at here. We have a positive x and a negative y. So this helps you determine, just by looking at a coordinate pair, what quadrant that pair is in based on the sign of the x and y. That is the coordinate pair. So if you have both your x and your y values positive, you know you're in quadrant 1, and so on. And we'll do a little bit of practice with that in this lesson. All right, so let's go ahead and turn to the next page, please. So let's take a look at this graph. Notice that we have 1 all the way out here, and a lot of space, a lot of lines between the origin and 1. And I want you to think back about how we used to label number lines, because that's going to come in handy here. So I want you to think about this. I'm going to write this up here. If I have a number line, and it starts at 0, and let's say this is 1, and I divide it into 5 equal pieces. Remember how we labeled that. So the first piece was 1/5, the second piece is 2/5, the third piece is 3/5, and we have 4/5. And we also want to think about the decimal equivalent to those. So 1/5, if you don't remember, you can do 5 into 1. And it doesn't fit into 1, so we have to add a 0 and a decimal, and put the decimal up there. And we know that 2 times 5 is 10. So my decimal for 1/5 is 0.2. And then 2/5 we know is double that, so it's 0.4, and this is 0.6, and this is 0.8. So you want to know both the fraction and the decimal version. So when we look at the graph, that's what each of these marks stands for that are between the origin and 1. So for example, this mark is going to be 0.2, and this mark will be 0.4. And I'm running out of room here, but this mark, for example, will be 0.8. So we're going to use that information now to graph some points that have some decimal and fraction coordinates. So let's take a look at this first one. Graph the following point, 0.8 and 1. So of course, we have our x and our y value. So I have to find 0.8 on the x-axis. So we know that that's right there. And then I need to go up 1, but 1 is all the way up here. Okay? So my point is going to be right there. And I'm going to draw a little arrow to that. All right, let's take a look at the second point. Negative 0.4, negative 1. Okay, so I start at the origin, and I need to find negative 0.4 on that axis. So that's going to be negative 0.2. That's going to be negative 0.4. And then my y-coordinate is a negative 1. So that's all the way down there. So that means my point is going to go right there. Okay? And we'll draw an arrow to there. And finally, for number 3, we have a fractional coordinate and a decimal coordinate. And so we have to figure out how that works. So let's take a look. I need 1/5. Well, just like 1/5 we know corresponds to 0.2. This 0.2 is also 1/5. So there's my x. And I need 0.6. So we know going up we have 0.2, 0.4, and 0.6. So I know that my point is going to go right there. All right, so the key to success when you're doing these kinds of graphs, of course, is you need to pay attention to the scale. Because for this graph, each square represents 1/5 or 0.2, not 1. So we have to keep in mind and figure out what the scale is in order to properly graph, particular coordinates. All right, well, let's take a look at going backwards now. I want to know what is the ordered pair for A. So again, if I start at the origin, how far over do I have to go to get to the A? So I've gone 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8. Of course, I'm moving to the left, so it's negative, and I know my x-coordinate is going to be negative 0.8. Okay, I'm going to write this down here. Negative 0.8, since I have a little space here. And then, how far up do I have to go from there to get to the y-coordinate? Well, we have all the way up to 1, and then one more space, so that's another 1/5, so it's either 1 and 1/5 or 1.2 to get to the y value. So my y value is 1.2, and again it's positive because I went up. And there's my ordered pair that goes with point A. To the left, 4 blocks to be 0.8, and up 1, and 1 block is 1.2. And again, just a reminder, this is also the same as 1 and 1/5, and this is the same as negative 4/5. All right, so we're going to do some practice with this, so go ahead to turn to the next page, please. So I want you to answer all of these questions. For this first group, you are finding the points and coming up with the ordered pair that goes with it. So like here's point A, for example, so you need to figure out what the scale is. And let me give you a hint with the scale. So again, if we're going from 0 to 1, and notice that there is one mark between 0 and 1, so this of course is going to be 1/2 or 0.5. So that's the kind of scale we're dealing with this particular graph. So for these, you're going to find the coordinate pairs. For these, you're going to find, these correspond to one of the letters on this graph, so you're going to try to identify which letter goes with each coordinate pair. And then I have a couple of extra questions I want you to check out as well. So pause the video, answer these questions, and then come back and check your answers and see how you did. All right, go ahead and check out these answers, and let me just note that for this question here, clearly the graph, we'd have a hard time graphing these points because the decimals here are kind of complex, and the graph isn't that finite, isn't that fine. We only have like halves that we can do on here. However, we're just asking what quadrant the point is in. And because the x value is negative and the y value is negative, that tells us that we are in quadrant 3. All right, if you got any of these wrong, see if you can figure out where you went wrong. Otherwise, you can go to the next page. All right, if you're watching this video in class, you have this assessment that I've given you already, so please complete this and turn it in, and you can get started on your homework once you have done that. Let me know if you have any questions.